Cosmic here, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about Grand Archive, specifically my onboarding experience thus far, and really just try to make a video that could help new players get into the game, because if you're like me and just kind of try to dive in headfirst, there is an overwhelming amount of information that you might have to just glean early on to really understand where the game is going and how to approach it, even if you are a veteran of card games. So in this video, I want to do a basic overview up front, which is going to be very high level just of classes and elements. So I wanted to do a meta report on Alchemical Revolution, the previous Grand Archive set, go through every single event that happened, all the archetypes, really just compile the data and give a easy to approach overview of each one of these decks and where players might be able to jump into the game and get started. And as I'll clarify at the end of the video, a lot of these lists are actually still very strong and even recently topped 8, not even just top 32, a top 8 past event. So they are definitely still viable going into this new meta. But of course, this is week 1 where you see a brand new format. So expect some of this to kind of evolve over time, but still a very good kind of jumping on point if you just don't know where to start and feeling overwhelmed by the sheer amount of choices that you can make. So yes, I do have some disclaimers up front that are definitely worth addressing. Yes, they're all here, but the big ones obviously to address up front is kind of understanding that the events they had overall coming from other card games would be the equivalent of store championships and Grand Prix or regionals, and just those two different dynamics will happen. So in some of the events that I ended up getting the information from, they had maybe 20 to 30 players, and other events that got recorded had 90 or even 120, 130, right? There is a little bit of a variance in terms of the overall size and just how often or how far people are willing to travel for these events. So do keep that in mind. But as I went over all 264 deck lists over 42 events, yes, this thing took me multiple days to put together. There was kind of a clear cut, winners of it in terms of what were the most representative archetypes, but I do want to add the disclaimer. This is not to say that these were the only decks that did well in this ALC format, but at least something that new players can say, hey, this is what I've noticed a lot of, this is what people are talking about as kind of key players, and it clearly put up numbers, so there's something behind it at least, right? Consistency definitely being a big one here, but some of these will be a little bit overgeneralized, if only because the goal of this is going to be for players who are new to Grand Archive, maybe coming from other IP-based games that are looking for something new to try, or just maybe, and this is probably the most important thing for me, is if you tried Grand Archive in the past and didn't like it, like day 1 or the print and plays, it is absolutely worth checking out again, and I'm glad that I had a chance to really dig into it, because I do think very strongly Set 4 is something special, and going forward, I think they're going to fix a lot of the issues that I personally had with the game, so I'm very, very positive, or very curious about where this might go from here. Other than that, TCG player prices is a bit all over the place. Even the time that it took to put these lists together and try to do like the mass entry, just because that was easiest, because again, I did it for, I think I did like 100 decks, and then I just gave up because the price ranges were close enough for, across the archetypes. But there are buyouts happening, so that is kind of the one negative thing I do have to mention up front, is that at the time of recording this, the literal snapshot of the time that this video is being recorded, prices are just not great. Now, I do think that we'll see more of that. People who are just selling on Discord might go back to TCG Player, because again, that is kind of like from an optics standpoint, that is generally what TCG players rely on, especially those from overseas. They do use TCG Player as kind of their guide marker until Card Market is set up, kind of as I talked about in a previous video. But right now, the prices are really kind of hidden in that regard to mostly Discord-based sales. So hopefully we'll see more of that change in the future. So again, please take these prices and just kind of the higher level discussions as a bit of a grain of salt, because again, prices have changed since I had time to put these in, and buyouts are causing some crazy things to happen. But I do hope that at least Weaves of the Shore can be strategic in how they're going to approach this, so that it doesn't just scare off new players from otherwise enjoying a really great game. Now, that said, the last thing I want to say here is just from a overall disclaimer, just to cover my own tracks, is that the lists are based on what topped in each event. I know I kind of hinted at this earlier on, but I really want to stress the fact that this is by no means meant to be a shot at players who maybe took things like Water Domain Tony or Water Sword Tony, which was actually a really cool deck when I saw it. Or my favorite list that did not make this cut was actually the Water Umbra Diana deck, which looked like so much fun and something that I would love to go back to. But at least from a overall meta standpoint, where we're just trying to understand kind of what are some large key themes that might have happened in the set. And again, going back to just what people played, it's pretty cut and dry in terms of what would ultimately make the cut when you're looking at the meta review overall compared to how you would approach it in other card games. So a little bit more about that in a little bit. But if you are a new player, you might have only just maybe you bought your recollection deck, maybe you've seen like the how to play on the website, whatever it might be, you might be feeling a little bit lost. So I do want to spend some time up front and at least get into the overall themes of the game, right? So up front, yes, you do have 7 total different classes that do play a role in this game. You will see things like class bonuses, which mean, hey, if you're using Ranger, you're going to get an additional effect when you use this card. However, that card will likely have other effects that can be used in other classes as long as you have the elements. So it's not as locked as other games like Flesh and Blood, but it does still have that rewarding factor where if you want to build into a theme, right? Like an assassin is obviously going to have very different theming than Guardian, right? Or a mage. These do still need to have their own flavors. And yes, while some of these lists might be more, unit focused where you don't get a lot of that flavor at times from what those champions want to be doing, there are some other decks out there that are really cool that I think did a fantastic job at showcasing what they can do. One of the things that I go back to is I've been, 3 weeks in now at the time recording this, is something that's important for me is like, I want to lose in a cool way. And that might be a really weird thing to say, but when you've played as many card games as I have, or maybe you come from an extensive background yourself, you might have just had that feeling where it's just like, oh, we're just having 2 units on the field and they kind of just battle it out and whatever, right? For me personally, one of the major reasons why I gravitate more towards Japanese trading card games, other than just like the random RNG elements, which can come up to make things a little bit more fun, is that you get to win or lose in really cool ways. One of my favorite memories so far of just digging into the game and understanding kind of what these different champions can do is I was going against a Tenoris Might of Humanity, is the guy right there in center as a Guardian, and he literally did the whole Unlimited Blade Works thing right at me where it's like, hey, I'm going to use this combination of cards. I'm going to summon, I think he summoned like 12 swords or whatever it was. And then the swords themselves can all sack themselves into one for one big attack. And then suddenly he's throwing this sword at me for 50 damage. And you have like 25 health at that point, right? 25 to 30. So you're just like, oh, I'm dead. And yes, there is counterplay to it. Like, I don't want to make the sense of like, oh, I was just completely dead. I had no counterplay, yada, yada. But like, I just lost in such a big, flashy way that by the end of it, I was just like, dude, that was really cool. And I asked them for their list and they were very kind to share. And I was like, this is so cool. Now, obviously, there is a point to be made about again, going back to the price at just a high level, like, it can be difficult to jump into these other decks at times, but something like TTS is always available for testing if you just want to go that route, right? And we don't have a community-made, online sim yet, but hopefully in the future we will see something more like that online. So other than that quick little side story, just getting back to the overall themes, right? You have your assassins, you're gonna have things like Striking from the Shadows, you're gonna have the Ranger, which is gonna have a lot of gun focus, Guardian, which is gonna have either defensive plays or big heavy swings. Mages have fireballs. Sylvie with the Tamers have beast allies and slimes, especially with the recollection decks that they get to rely on. Warriors have these really cool sword effects and rallying the troops. And Cleric doesn't exist. That is a little bit of a joke, but unfortunately, Arasana, who is a little bit lagging in terms of the overall meta, yeah, she's a little bit sad in terms of where it is, but it is a really cool deck if you are someone who wants to have a little bit of a roll of the dice in terms of just getting to create potions and collect herbs to have these payoffs. It can be really fun, but ultimately it does feel a bit lacking compared to some of the other classes in terms of not only overall identity, but also just how well they can execute on that if you go down that route. Now, that said, there are other things that you can do, like a very aggressive fire strategy with Arasana, and then you can just be like throwing pots at your opponent and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. But at the same time, there are other champions that can do that with a fire focus and still be more aggressive, that it doesn't really get the chance to really shine on its own, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more later when we get to more of the Arthur style of decks, but something that I am really looking forward to seeing how they expand in the future. So I could go into these in a little bit more detail, but it would create a much longer video. However, I will have timestamps where you can skip ahead to the different deck lists that I'm going to cover. And I did try to do my best to show like, oh, if this is a Ranger that's being being used in this list, this is what makes it special. Or if they're using a Guardian or Warrior, kind of what are the key pieces. So if you want to have more of that level of detail, please make sure to skip ahead. And of course, we will have more to talk about in future meta reports if we dive into it. Or you can go check out the last top 8 meta report where we get into Sylvie, who didn't make this list because she wasn't that great until the recollection decks, but now got a very serious buff that is worth checking out. So champions and kind of that key focus out of the way, let's get into the basic elements themselves. So there are 3 in total. You're going to have fire, wind, and water. And then, of course, we're going to have some advanced elements. So starting things off with fire. Yes, if you've played something like Magic the Gathering, this one is going to make a lot of sense. It is really just going to be, a lot of direct damage, a lot of using your health as a resource, and then just trying to churn through your deck very quickly with something like Creative Shock, right? This is going to be the speed element, as it were, be it either for the units that you want to have on the board that are going to be swinging and applying pressure and then doing damage on top of that, just from an overall aggressive, gas on the pedal strategy. And then, of course, the other filtering to help build into these big plays. Now, some of the other things that we see, like Spark and like some of the other removal, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it is going to be very heavy damage based. But of course, some of the other elements do also have that. It's not exclusively in red like some other games that have like, Lightning Bolt, to make that example. But it is something that you'll see quite a bit more often, especially in mages having that kind of fire bonus, getting some kind of extra damage or extra effect when they really get to use it. So something we'll be seeing a little bit more of, and the other one is Impact Hammer from the most recent set that, if you use it, you have to take 3 damage, but it's a very efficient attacking weapon. It is something I'm expecting to see a little bit more developed in future sets, but fire is that element that's going to help speed up your game strategy and really make sure that you can get into those late game plays that you want to be making, while also having some very scary and some very aggressive early starts. Up next, we have Spirit of Water, which, if you know me, I'm a huge fan of blue in any card game, so of course this is where I am trying to cook the most, and this one is really interesting. Yes, it does have some of that counter magic or counter play like you would like to expect. Cerulean Decree is just kind of the newest card that really puts it all into one, right, where you have the negate effect, you can do shrinking of damage, but what's really cool about Water is that it also has this kind of self-mill payoff strategy with Floating Memory, especially with Icebound Slam. So we've seen a little bit of this in the previous sets, but I really do feel like set 4 brought this all together in a way that makes sense and allows the decks to really capitalize it with cards like Lost in Thought. Now, that said, there are some other parts of just like, hey, having floating memory is always a good thing because it helps you go level up into your champions, materialize things otherwise out of your material deck, or just play for other costs when needed. So having something like Icebound Slam that can ideally threaten a lot of damage and help build up into some other payoffs is just an all-around really great thing to see. And then Fracturize kind of being one of the key staples in Water, it turns out, just having more counterplay and how you're going to be interacting with your opponent's items or weapons that can really kind of trip up your opponent. So what I really like about Water in this game too, it has more of that just like really trying to get that incremental advantage at times turn over turn, or find enough ways to disrupt what your opponent wants to be doing that either, the counter spell, stopping an attack, minusing something for damage so they don't kill your unit, right? It definitely does have more of that control mage element feel to it that I certainly love and appreciate. That said, I do think Water is probably the weakest element overall, just from a overall deck building standpoint, both from where it was in Alchemical Revolution, also where I think it is in the current set, but I would love to be proven wrong because I think also the artwork, I just love the artwork for this element the most kind of across the board. But again, I'm biased, I'm a blue mage in every card game I play, so of course I am going to like this one the most. And then lastly, we have Wind, which really feels a lot like Force of Will back in the day for me. Like, the more I learn about this and the more I see these decks kind of come together, it really has that, like, really focused on playing the board, but then also in this most recent set, and you might have kind of picked up on this by now, but set 4 just was a very good set in my opinion from both the recollection decks and the type of refinement that it brought overall to the game, that it gives me a lot of faith in kind of the forward direction. So I hate to sound like a broken record, and I'm probably gonna mention that a few more times, but set 4 is actually just very, very good, and it does give me a lot of hope for where the future of this game is going to be going. Zephyr, a huge, huge, huge key spell that we're going to see, and something you'll probably see as a 4 of in every single win list, or at least every single win list it feels like that I've seen so far, because just getting to suppress something can be such a strong ability. And then what's also cool is they have a lot of these like new tax effects. So something that wasn't just like strictly limited to blue, where it's like, oh, I'm countering it, I have to play from hand. Now green or win has some threats on the board that says, hey, I'm going to have this disruptive effect that you have to either answer or find a way to play around it otherwise, which is really cool because it's definitely more of like heavy board focused, where water is going to be more of like play the hand minigame, right? And then of course things like Scout the Land, just giving us insane value by being able to look at the top cards of our deck, draw some cards. And there's also another one, I think it's Glimpse of Fairies off the top of my head, which allows us to scry a couple cards and then draw if it's green, right? So getting more of that like hand churning and drawing ability. So it's not just red is like the only draw color out there, but wind actually has some really cool stuff here that it's got in the next set as well. So that is just a very quick overview of the elements themselves and just really talking about them at a high level. You'll see us play out a little bit better in each one of the archetypes, but I at least want to give a quick rundown of maybe some iconic spells that you or cards you can expect, as well as kind of how they fill the role in a lot of the decks that we're going to be talking about here on the next few points. Now, the last thing I want to mention is the advanced elements. Now, this is where I do have to make a pause, and something that I think is truly the best part of Grand Archive, but it is also the most underdeveloped part of Grand Archive. When you look at the overall meta and kind of as I was going through a lot of these lists, ultimately, a lot of them kind of just ignored where the advanced elements were at. And there could be a myriad of reasons for that, right? But just from an overall purely analytical standpoint, advanced elements were something that were largely unexplored or at least underperforming in Alchemical Revolution. Now, in the current set, we do see a lot of Umbra going on. We did see a little bit of Luxem in the previous set. And Terra is actually coming online now thanks to the Recollection decks. But even like the Neos, which is probably, I shouldn't say it's my favorite, probably Astra is my favorite overall because spoiler my name, but the Neo stuff has been really cool every time I look at it. And then Crux has been like the one that's like, yep, we're here, we're doing the cool thing. What about the rest of us, right? So one thing that I really hope that we get to see more on in the future, even if it does heavily restrict your deck building, I hope we get to see more of these advanced elements come together and kind of more fleshed out into other options we have. Now, that's probably going to look like other level 3 champions coming out that enable these strategies, and then other advanced element cards that works with them. So it's not just like, oh, this one version of this one champion keeps getting buffed, right? You want to definitely diversify the different play patterns they have beyond that, but I can definitely understand where if you think about the game mechanic itself, like the basic elements make up the vast majority of your gameplay. It's going to make up like 90% of your game. So it makes sense that the advanced elements don't carry the same weight when you think about how many cards they make up in the overall card pool from set to set and things of that nature. But definitely something I'm excited to see how they evolve over time, because I think a lot of like the really cool flavor of this game is really tied up in the advanced elements. Maybe not Crux, or maybe it's just because, like, I don't know the lore. Crux is the one that's just, like, they're just really good, I guess, because you have things like Phantasm that's just, like, or you have things like Pendragon, which are just absolutely insane, but some of the other flavor in the other ones is just a lot cooler, in my opinion, because of how they all line up and play off one another. So that is something I won't spend too much time going on into this video, because, again, it really didn't pop up, and, of course, we don't have all of the advanced elements yet. We just got the product info sheet live earlier today that showcased a new advanced element, or at least hinted at a new advanced element that's going to be coming later this year. So I definitely think if there's like one kind of high level note, I would say overall, outside looking in, Grand Archive is really laying the foundation in its first year. It will probably take until this next set to have that foundation finished, but then every set after that will probably have a huge impact on the overall gameplay and experience of how people are approaching not only your basic level deck building with the basic elements, but as well as your advanced elements really getting the chance to shine with the different flavors and, again, either lore applications or otherwise that really makes it feel special. That is like the one thing that I keep going back to in my own onboarding process when I think about the overall card pool and how I want to be deck building, is that a lot of the issues, in my opinion, with the game can just be solved by a deeper pool, and that is going to take time. However, that's not a reason alone that I would say it's not worth checking out. Obviously, I spent a lot of time on this video, so clearly I think Grand Archive is a game worth checking out, but I can definitely understand where some people are really looking for that high-level flavor of the advanced elements really shining through can be a little bit lackluster, especially if you're like me who loves Astra and you have to rely on Arasana. Unfortunately, which does not work, it turns out, or at least hasn't worked out thus far. Hopefully somebody can crack the code eventually. So with that, again, we had over 264 decks that I looked at, and I want to talk about this at a high level as I, kind of talk through the methodology and kind of get into what archetypes really shine through in all of this, as well as just putting some context to the overall card pool. So the first thing I want to describe here on the side is a 618 out of 776. One of the things that I want to try to put some context into is, right, at the end of the day, Grand Archive is a open deck building in the sense that, like, there's not a leader, there's not a specific archetype that you have to focus on, but understanding that there are limits in how you approach deck building. You start with the basic spirit, and that is automatically going to cut away 2/3 of your deck building opportunities, right? Obviously, rounding exaggeration, I forget what the exact number is, but think about it in that line. So what I want to do is look at the opportunities for if you remove things like champions and advanced elements, how many cards are ultimately left in your pool? Because as I mentioned previously, that is going to make up about 90% of your gameplay experience and game building process. So that's where we end up with the 618 number. Now, it's really important to note that the next set is going to have something like 240 cards. We'll talk about that later when we get to that slide, but it's just something to keep in mind at the top of your head. The other anecdote here with the 776 is that is all the advanced element cards that are added in as well. However, something to consider that is if you look at advanced elements, you are automatically shoehorned into certain champions, into certain level 3s because of where the card pool is at today. So to do a kind of more base level comparison, to be fair about it, I didn't want to include advanced elements. Now, that said, when we look at some of the other just card games that myself and hopefully my friends who are watching this, who are currently playing, are looking at this to try to add some context, like how big is the card pool for year one overall for some other card games? Obviously, you can look at this channel and the games I've covered in the past, but Battle Spirits Saga, when we talk about the unique starters, and if we talk about the unique card sets, you're looking at about 624 cards. And yes, in that game, we do have monocolor decks, and we have literally 6 color decks and everything in between. So truly, that is like the most open, using my air quotes here, compared to the other 3 that we're talking about today. But something to keep in mind that overall, when I look at Grand Archive, at least where it is year one, it does fall more in line with a Japanese trading card game card pool, to where it's understandable that some of these other archetypes or plans weren't as fleshed out as we might want them to be. Lorcana, when I was doing some digging, is 816 cards. And then Star Wars Unlimited, which I removed leaders and bases for the same exact reasons I just removed advanced elements. And they had a whopping 888 cards planned for year one. Again, assuming that we see a similar booster box size or booster set size. I looked on the website, there was like was it 220, and then like the next other one was like 202. So there's going to be a slight variation, but it's over 200 cards per set. And there was also some cards in the starter decks that are exclusives as well. So by far and away, Star Wars Unlimited is the largest card pool, and just from a overall deck building standpoint, is going to be the largest one on this list in terms of opportunities because of how their deck building philosophically works, with the aspects and the aspect penalties mean that that game is actually significantly more open than anything else that we're going to be talking about, because the aspect penalty just says, hey, if you really want to, you could just run all colors in one deck, and you just have to pay that extra cost, right? So obviously, I don't think we're going to be seeing any, all aspect decks in Star Wars Unlimited anytime soon, but something at least to acknowledge up front here for if you're coming from other card games, that can give you a general basis to work off of. Now, that said, just looking at the overall meta impact, we had 52% of the decks of the 264 that made top 8 were fire, 27% were water, and 21% were wind. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, I've been kind of giving a lot of behind the scenes looks and kind of tweeting out the various numbers and all that stuff. Fire actually ended up winning something like 60% of the overall events as well. I forget what the exact number was, but fire was very good in the previous set. And the thing I really want to, kind of highlight here, or really stress as we're about to get into each one of these lists, is that it's not just fire was good, right? It's not that one single deck made up for all of that, right? Fire itself is really the most flexible because of things like the cremation ritual and the creative shock, which just allows you for the extra filtering. So all things considered, if you were to take 2 equal decks that have a 60 card, 4 card max, right? And you say, here's what this one wants to be doing, but here's what this one wants to be doing, and has significantly more draw, filtering, and cycling. spoiler, that deck is naturally going to be better, in generally speaking, across all TCGs. So it's not exactly surprising to see that Fire kind of crept up in that in terms of the overall play percentage, and also why we're seeing now with Wind, and again, we'll talk about the most recent event here at the very end, that yes, shocker, Wind is doing very, very well. And then Water as the one that kind of stands alone by itself. Yes, it really did just have the one archetype that stood out overall, but it did have some other fringe cases where, you know, maybe people didn't find the right builds, or maybe people just weren't as excited to play that one as some of the other lists that they found, and that's why I didn't have enough representation. Again, whatever it might be, this was just the overall look at what each one of these archetypes kind of boiled down to. And then this last category that we have here with the card back in the image is just truly the other category. So what I did is just try to look at all 264 decks, find out which ones were the most similar, break them down into a overall high level archetype in terms of like what are decks that have similar cards within them, and then where was kind of like the break point. So the last one here that we have with Rai had I think 13 tops if I remember correctly, and then everything below that, which the next highest was 7 wins, or 7 tops I should say, was just not enough representation, so it got put into the other category. And this is pretty typical of what we see with a lot of trading card games, right? At the end of the day, that while there might be other viable competitive decks, be it because they're too hard to play, they're too expensive, whatever it might be, there are usually other competitively viable decks, but they don't always get the same representation as some of the other lists, and they kind of get lost in the shadows of some of the other bigger players. Again, for them to be lesser or not as good, it's just something that doesn't always come up when you're doing this very like highest level aggregate look at the data. So where does that bring us, right? So this is our numerical representation of how many times that these archetypes made top 8 and the cost of the decks associated with them. Again, huge disclaimer, it took me several days to compile all this data, to do all the pricing, all that stuff. So depending on when you're watching this video, the buyouts might have already impacted these price points, but I at least, again, wanted to provide some information on what is the overall play style, as well as the price points, so that you can make a more educated approach if you're someone like me who was just trying to jump in the game and figure out a good starting point. So while there is a very aggro-heavy focus within these lists, I also want to highlight that there is other versions that are either mid-range or control that also popped up in this meta that I think are going to carry over quite well into the next set. So there is truly going to be a archetype for everyone out there to enjoy and to jump into the game with. Now, the other thing I will kind of call out here in terms of the highest price that really sticks out, it is going to be the Fire Umbra Diana list, because of a single card that is $65 as it is today. That is a mandatory 3 to 4 of if you really want to get the most out of that archetype, because in my opinion, it also got a really good buff in the most recent set if you change the build slightly, that I think will actually push that into a one category higher from a tier list standpoint. Now, I need to do some brewing, but I also don't want to buy that card yet, so I'll have to figure out if I have time to do it on TTS. But in terms of again, I really like the Water Umbra Diana list, and that's something that I want to start with, but I do need to get a couple key cards before I dive into that. So with a quick overview out of the way, let's get into each one of these lists and talk about a little bit more of their play style. So up first, we're going to have the Water Allies, and we're just going to go through this in order and really just try to highlight a little bit of the differences, right? Now, something I do want to mention up front about these lists is that I won't be covering the material deck for any of them, but when I was looking into these archetypes from a meta-analysis standpoint, largely they were similar, other than a few exceptions, which I'm going to often call out in the bottom right corner, or just cover at a high level as I'm going through these lists. So something to consider is like the main deck, and just wanting to showcase where some of the different class bonuses come into play and what really makes them kind of different and exciting. So up first, we have Water Allies, which you're going to see this wonderful card, Gildas, time and time again. That is just a great, efficient, aggressive strategy if you are able to meet its condition of balance. So allies in general just means that you're going to be playing a lot of units to the board that are either going to have some kind of impact themselves or are just efficient. The really cool thing about Grand Archive, as we're going to be going through these lists, some of them are going to be, strictly unit focused. Some of them are going to be a little bit of mix of, some units and some spells, and others are just going to be, well, nope, I'm going to go just all big spells and lightning bolt you, right? So there is going to be that level of variation as well. So there are different things that you can look forward to in terms of how you want to play the game and really expand out on those. So with Water Allies, as I mentioned, you're going to have some of these key things like Gildas, who are going to be, really strong in the pressure that they're applying, But then also, now here's where I want to showcase some of the differences between Diana, who is the Ranger class, and Zander, who is the Assassin. And this is where we really start to see some of those class bonuses pay off. So for Ranger, you have the ability to give something distance, which is going to make sure that they can't get hit for that turn, or it's going to allow for some extra type of bonus, like the Sharpshooter that, yes, is in both of these lists. But then Sharpshooter, if you make it distant, is actually going to get +2 attack. So then it becomes a 4/3 while it gets that attack in. And that can be really important for getting in those couple extra chip points of damage, while also, you know, the champion itself is going to have some bonus, depending on if you go all the way up to level 3 or not, for being distant to have that ranged effect and really get that extra, you know, value for using these cards. And then something else like Seeking Shot, which is appeared in a lot of these lists, to be fair, because it gives True Sight, which means it can allow you to attack into your opponent's stealth characters, which is otherwise very annoying to deal with. But now it also has the class bonus of cannot be retaliated, so you can't take the damage back from your unit. So overall, a very good card itself for allowing Ranger to have a little bit of extension of its plays. And then from the water allies, right, we talked about the water theme overall and just kind of the disruption that it wants to rely on, right? So we have the Korhazi Trapper, which is going to have the -3 damage effect. We have Fracturize, which we talked about up front. Freezing Hail, which is going to deal damage and lock something down for a turn. So more of like that stasis style effect. Frostbind being your counterspell, Frostsworn Paladin playing off that floating memory theme that we talked about earlier, while also becoming a 3/4 drawing card is actually insane. And then the other card that just like, the Frostbinder Priest was just so annoying to play against when I was, you know, trying to set up my defenses, and I talked about this in my last video, but because all your opponent's stuff comes into play rested, it can be really difficult to set up like those taunts or try to get those annoying intercepts, you know, units up, so your opponent just can't attack directly into your champion. So a lot of ways that you really want to tackle that board that way. Or if the next turn that something becomes untapped from the priest effect, you go, sorry, here's a Snow Fairy exhausted again, and it's going to stay exhausted until my unit, or until this unit specifically, leaves the field, right? So a lot of good disruption opportunities. Now, yes, this does lead a little bit more onto, here's a couple like very strong onboard play effects versus what you're going to be doing from hand, from a spell card, but something to consider like how you want to be attacking the meta. And then Song of Frost is just also a really strong card, because it gives you the ability to just stop a combat, and just if you're trying to hit with an Icebound Slam, nope, you're not allowed to have that either. So for decks that want to have like that go tall strategy and really just slam in with one attack, Song of Frost is going to make you think twice about it. So when Rangers want to be going distant, you know, what does Assassin have? And that's where we look to things like Thieving Cut, which is going to have the preparation counters. So, you know, Ranger wants to play with their guns and have the different bullet effects. Assassins are going to have things like these prep counters and are going to have other ways that they want to attack or get special bonuses if they use those counters, which is exactly what we're going to see in things like Thieving Cut. Drown Cut, just having floating memory if you're a assassin, is really important. Again, that floating memory allows you to level up easier, play some other stuff out of your materialization deck. It's very important and just a very good class bonus to have. And then the assassin card that I really like is actually Neo, which allows you to look at your opponent's memory, choose a card, and then it's going to cost one more. So this again lies into the disruption plan that Water wants to be doing, that if they are really banking on that one card on their next turn, making it even cost one more can be really, really taxing for them. Or if you have something like Chilling Touch, which can temporarily banish one of their cards from memory, that's where you have a little bit of that, you know, incremental tax effects on a, you know, turn-to-turn basis that can really disrupt your opponent's strategy. So for Water allies, what this really comes down to is things like Prototype Pistol in your materialization, which is going to be a gun that Diana can use to get in a little more chip damage, versus the Poison Dagger, which is only available for assassins, that really allows you to get in extra points of damage per unit attack over attack. And that thing is explosive in the amount of damage that it can put together. So if you really like more unit focused play, and, you know, not to call it Delver, but it does remind me of that, like, you know, Mono Blue Devotion or Delver playstyle, where it's like, play these good units on board that get an effect, that have disruption, swing through and have some type of protection for them, then Water Allies is absolutely going to feel a deck that's at home for you and really nice to dive into. Moving on from there, we have Fire Crux Merlin. And this is one that's actually a dual type, so it has mage and warrior. And this one is a little bit more refined in terms of like how much variation happens between the lists. And very specifically, the ones that we're referencing that we put together was either going to have the 2 different level 3s at the top end, but when you look at the list kind of side by side, they were quite similar. But this is a deck that is now playing a little bit of the, yes, I want the early game aggression, but then I want to have like this really big fireball that's hitting for 6, 7, or 8 damage at the top end that my opponent has to respect as well. So this is what I would call more of like a battle mage style of class, because it really does fill that role. And then of course with the hybrid version of the deck, you can actually lean a little bit more into the warrior specialization, which is really cool as well. But in general, you're going to have a lot of these units or a lot of cards that have floating memory. One, because Merlin can use them to level up with its own effect. If your opponent has nothing that you can remove and you have a little bit extra that you're discarding through something like Creative Shock, then you want to make sure that you're using them to level up with your character so that your fireballs get even bigger towards the end. Now, the one thing that we go back to with fire that we talked about was really about all of the damage-based removal and board control. So the one thing that we see here, is pretty similar between the Creative Shock and Cremation Ritual. Just being good to filter through the deck, you really have to worry about how am I controlling the board so I can get to my level 3 and make sure I'm using those effects, right? In the more, what I would call just like traditional battle mage up to Merlin is going to be the Purge and Flames, which is going to be a nice like AoE effect. And then there's a bunch of different cards you can rely on, but Spark, as we talked about earlier, which deals 3 unpreventable damage. There are 4 damage spells depending on how the meta goes. If they were playing more shields and 3 HP is good, that's fine. If people are relying more on like 4 HP units, then there's other cards you can lead into as well. But generally, again, having things like the Stalwart Shieldmate, which helps you survive the early turns, it counts as floating memory. And then things like Exercise Curses, which was probably a meta call at the time, but this can really be pretty flexible in terms of just another card of floating memory that we don't hate to discard when we need to. So something to keep in mind is that you will have a little bit higher of a floating memory count in this deck compared to other decks in the format, other than the Icebound Slam water deck. But there are multiple ways that you can really use it and get the value out of it. So this is something that's definitely going to have more of a mid-range to control feel, depending on like what the matchup is. But having that flexibility to where if the game goes long enough, you can just slam down a double fireball and get the value that way. That is going to give your opponent a hard time to recover. Now, that said, the other part I want to call out here is in the hybrid version, they're really trying to do like the Prismatic Edge value. So Prismatic Edge, what allows you to do is for your cards in memory, for each type revealed, you get an effect. So yes, we can't actually use the Chilling Touch or the Scatter Essence. This is something that we want to have in our memory to then line up for an effect that gets extra value for the other stuff that we want to be doing. And plus, it is just a good 3 attack, but generally speaking, we want the value that's going to provide and not always just the attack side of it, because then we'll finish something off with a fireball anyways. So very high level quick rundown. But again, if you want to say like, oh, I don't want to be all in on units, maybe a little bit of units and a little bit of spells, then I think Fire Crux Merlin is going to be a fantastic spot to start. But this one is a little bit more streamlined in the Mage Warrior Flex that you're going to be focusing on really these cards. And we didn't see as much variation between these very specific lists, although there were some other Fire Crux decks that did pop up. These variations of Merlin were quite similar. Now moving on from there, we have Wind Allies, which again is something that is going to play the board with very aggressive units and good value. But now we have the difference of, hey, do I want to go tall with a Guardian and go up to level 2 and just slam 9 damage with this heavy swing at my opponent? Or do I want to go for Lorraine and talk about the, warriors assembling and getting value out of that way, where now we're going very wide on our board. We're having all these buff effects. We now have swords that are dealing 2 damage instead of 1, and you get chip damage that way. Really just Banner Knight and things like Phalanx Captain really giving you that extra push of damage that you're going to need because you were able to set up your board so wide and establish it, right? So even though these 2 decks do have a lot of similarities between them, as well as the winning list that we saw from this past weekend, it is something that if you want to go into the Guardian side or Warrior side, you can expand on that a little bit more. Now, the other thing I do want to mention here between the cards themselves, again, is going into things like the floating memory that we see here. from the Guardian versus Warrior. So that is something that you'll have to still kind of see where that comes into play and how you want to get the value out of the Warrior specific. Now, that said, we of course still have things like Dream Fairy, or what I like to call the even more annoying version of Meddling Mage for those that know, but it bounces a card back to your opponent's memory, and then as long as that Dream Fairy is on board, you can't replay it. Now, yes, it does have stealth, so this is why we've seen so much of that True Sight appear in this previous meta, so you can actually attack it. But if you are doing something like Merlin, where you have like the AoE effects anyways, or just other damage to ping it away, you can still take care of it in that way instead of having to rely on True Sight. So there are multiple ways to answer it and get rid of it, but it can still be really annoying if it's one of your key units that you need to have on the field and they just Dream Fairy it away and go, oopsies, I still have this. Or if, because we are playing Wind, we have things like Zephyr, where you can just suppress your own guy and make sure that that stays on board. Now, yes, they are going to reset that card, so to speak, but then you can just bounce it or flicker wisp it, I guess I should say, or, you know, the good old, you know, magic terms once again. But then you can just remove something else instead if they try to do it. But it, much like how Snow Fairy was able to exhaust something but keep it on board, Dream Fairy is just going to be the other fairy that makes your opponent's board really difficult for them to expand on the way they want to, either by locking something down or just saying a hard no in terms of how they want to develop their game plan. Now, outside of that, the really cool thing that we see here in a lot of these lists that just doesn't seem something that would be really important, but Woodland Squirrels just being a 0 cost and a 1/1, really helping you align with that balanced strategy with Gildas so that you can still get your value and making sure that you're getting that extra attack to really push through the damage. Now, the last thing I want to say for Wind allies overall is that you'll see here is the Academy Guides. This card is insanely priced right now. You can definitely cut that one. For a lot of the other Wind ally lists that we saw, that was not even a consideration. It's just something that I want to, this is a list I want to include because it really showcased the two differences between Warrior and Guardian, between the like the all-in, go wide, anthem the board versus the go tall, really hard-hitting, heavy swing that Guardian can do. And then also, you know, still showcase where a lot of the other cards are fairly similar, all things considering. And there was also some class bonus cards, like the Vanguard here, that's actually Guardian and Warrior, that was played in both lists that both get the class bonuses, right? So this is one that I'm really curious to see how else it expands on, just to see where else it can go from here. And then one of the other key parts that we didn't really talk about up front because it's not as expanded on as I would really think that it is for, like, you know, the green strategy for card games is Attune with the Winds to get a buff counter on something, which is just a +1/+1. But it turns out getting that extra buff can be really good. And also because damage, like magic, is going to, you know, refresh at the end of the round, sometimes using that +1/+1 as a battle trick so that your unit still lives, while then also applying extra damage on the following turn, can be really strong. So that is something to look out for as well, that the extra attack damage that you can get can be pretty surprising off things like Attune with the Winds or even the food buffs that we see in the slime. So yes, this goes back to very unit heavy focus and how you want to be interacting with the board. Now, as I mentioned, water is going to have a lot of, you know, hand combat tricks that's going to, you know, counter spells and things of that nature, where Wind, while yes, is going to be a couple spells, a lot of it is kind of playing to the board, playing to the advantage that you have, and then figuring out which one of those big finishers that you want to rely on, with Heavy Swing just being a standalone attack, or something like Phalanx Captain and Banner Knight, which is going to give you a lot of damage out of nowhere if you were able to survive and go wide on those turns where your opponent didn't have like a cleave effect or something of that nature. So a little bit different of a flavor of a unit-focused deck, but definitely something still worth looking into. Now, when we get to some of the other decks here towards the end, there is very little variation between them, but still worth giving a good shout out for how they impacted the meta and kind of where I think they'll still be. And if I'm not mistaken, every single one of these archetypes actually made top 32 of the 200+ player event we had just this past weekend. But Fire Luxem Zander is definitely going to be your annoying control prison style of deck that I think people who really like that lockdown style, this is going to be the deck for you. Luxem wants to survive to level 3, and yes, it is called Fire because, as I mentioned earlier, hey, Creative Shock, we just need to find those combo pieces, as soon as possible so we can set up our strategy. So level 3 Zander allows you to look at the cards from your memory, and then your opponent has to put a card down based on how many Luxem elements that you show. But then you also have things like Lightweaver's Assault and Luxem Sight that gain even more value when they're shown out of your memory. So this is a deck that very quickly, if it can get to level 3, get that stuff online, it can be very hard to come back from because they're dealing you damage and healing every single turn. And then we also have really fun stuff like Vanish from Sight that we see also in the Rai Fire deck that says, hey, I'm going to pick a turn, you just can't attack me this turn, and I'm going to be safe, right? And sometimes that's all you need. When you're playing a lot of these, like, go to level 3 and set up for X, Y, or Z game plans, you just need a couple of those turns where you say, hey, look, nope, I'm safe, I have stealth, don't hit me, don't look at me, deploy some stuff, go next, right? So that can help buy you extra time because then it is a fog for a turn that allows you to then materialize an extra card. Be that a level up, be that a dagger that you need out of your deck, be it a GCR to draw an extra card, whatever it might be, it allows you just that extra turn of relief that you might really look forward to. Now, Dungeon Guide, by now you've probably seen this card or have heard about it, but yes, it is really important in these level 3 decks because you get to level up twice in a turn, which can be very, very important for getting your effects online. Again, in this case being kind of the Luxem lock, as it were, that I've got to play against this once, and I was very lucky I won by mill because if the game went any longer, they were just healing too much and I was not able to get consistent enough damage. So it is very much the, in terms of a hard control style of strategy, it's really the only thing that we have in Grand Archive so far from like a control/prison perspective from other Magic or other card game terminology, but something to definitely consider if you're looking for more of that very fun and interactive gameplay of locking out your opponent for a turn and then just showing them all this damage that you can have turn after turn. It's definitely the slow creeping in death that's waiting for them when you're able to build that board up and make sure you get the effect. And then the other thing to mention here is that Excalibur, Cleansing Light, just being able to destroy target non-champion object, that's just a straight deletion. Like, one, it's a good card because it's Luxem and you want to be, revealing it anyways, but a card that is just a very nice get out of jail for them in terms of if they have something annoying that they need to interact with, that's going to take care of it for them. And then the other, again, part going back to Creative Shocks, you can help find all of these pieces. So if you are someone who is a more control-focused player who really wants to survive to that late game and just make sure that you lock up the game by the damage that you're able to provide turn after turn while healing, then Fire Luxem is a very solid list for you. Now, the don't call it Fire allies, but it basically has the same philosophy, is I put Arthur Go Fast, but it is really just like Lorraine aggro or Zander aggro, whichever version you want to call it, it is just the other element getting its aggressive strategy online. But however, this one is really cool because from a, element to element or class to class perspective, this is one that has the most diversity in what you can actually put into the deck when I was looking over the overall, again, meta analysis that I was doing. Because in Warrior, you have things like Fiery Momentum, which, by the way, that card just slaps. I got hit for like 10 or 11 damage off of that because they were able to hit like double Hasty Messenger, which means you're just filling up their graveyard, and I didn't know about Lantern at the time. So it gets you that top end damage that way really, really quickly, where Assassin, they do have a couple cards that kind of, lean into like what makes an assassin special and some of those class bonuses, but for the thing that like really stands out by itself is just a 1-for-4 attack because it does have prepare 1, so you have to burn a prep counter. But on attack, if it was prepared, it gets +2. So for 1 cost, it's a 4 damage attack, which then can line up with some of the regalia that you want to be using, or I should say the dagger that you want to be using that can bring itself back from the graveyard for banishing fire cards. But generally, it's just a super efficient version. Now, what makes Fire perhaps good over the other versions, because you will see that there is a certain card called Gildas here missing, is Arthur. So like we saw in the Lorraine Wind Ally version, where you just have like, hey, I want to pump the board and go wide and have this other stuff. Arthur is all of that in one body that, oh, by the way, also can't die the turn that it comes into play because of his effect. So as long as he's rested, all your other allies get +1. So effectively what you do is, turn 1, put Arthur into play. He gains the fact that he has immortality until the next turn. on your next turn, swing for 2, and then every other unit that swings after him is getting a +1. And then, of course, if you have multiple Arthurs, that stacks up and gets very dangerous very, very quickly, and you will often die while they're still on a Fire Spirit if they get their more aggressive starts kind of out of the way. So if you are looking for a aggressive strategy that has like that lightning bolt or that like, you know, burn on the top end, then fire aggro is definitely going to be the one to go, because you have blazing throw, which, you know, they're going to come across, hit you with their weapon, be it with the ignited stab or maybe one of the warrior specific cards, and then they're going to go, oh, by the way, now I'm going to literally throw my weapon at your face for 4 damage, and you're like, yep, I guess that's it, because that is a lot of damage at the end of the day that's coming across, you know, in a single turn at you. So where water and wind really had other ways where they're more focused on like play the board and have those effects, fire instead is really, hey, I'm going to throw stuff at you and I really hope you can survive, because if not, this blazing throw is going to come over the top and really get the rest of that damage in. So definitely something to consider. But if you've played like very traditional any card game and played red aggro, this is red aggro. This is very much, you're going to feel right at home. I promise you, this is the one that you're like, yep, I've played card games before. Fire aggro, go burr, right? You know, there are a couple interesting points with like how the material deck works and some of the weapons that you can get out. But at least if you're someone who likes red deck wins, this is a list for you. Definitely look into the archetype. And again, probably should have mentioned this up front. I'll have a link to Luxera's map in the comments, but you'll know where to go and where to find these lists very quickly. Now, getting into kind of the last two here is the Fire Umbra Diana. So this is going to be the Ranger list and one of the first ones that we see. And now getting into our advanced element outside of the Luxem deck that we showcased, right? So extremely limited. And then also keep in mind from an overall topping standpoint, this one only had 12, if I remember correctly. So 12 out of 264 lists that we looked at, definitely a bit limited. But what I really love about this list, or what I really like about Diana in general, is it has this curse effect that you can apply to like really set that creeping death on your opponent. And then Shadow's Twin allows you to double up on with on-hit effects with things like Incendiary Shot that will then deal 4 damage. So it's attacking for 2, on-hit it's going to deal 2, the on-hit's going to trigger again, deal 2 more. Like, it could just pump out a lot of damage out of nowhere that your opponent might not be expecting. And again, this one has a very different play style than a lot of the other decks we've kind of talked about up until this point. So this is where I really only had like one good list to show because a lot of them were similar. But now we're talking about, you know, getting distant, making sure our opponent's getting extra damage that way. We have multiple guns that we can be using, and then bullets. So this one's a little bit different, where a lot of the other weapons that we've seen so far in Grand Archive or talked about up to this point are things like swords or just generic attacks that, you know, just attack by themselves. They just get to go across at your opponent and you deal them damage. Guns actually do require a bullet to be able to attack with them and get an effect, but the bullets are special and they do unique things, which again is really, really cool, and what makes me excited about this archetype in particular, because it is just so different from what we've seen from a lot of the other ones that I really hope gets a little bit more support in the, you know, kind of next set. So again, as I mentioned, we're going to have a total of 3 different guns in our materialization deck that we're going to use. Shadow's Twin, you can't really use until level 3 because of Diana Duskstalker, but we have Dungeon Guides to get there easier. We have Fast Cure, which can heal us, let us stabilize a little bit. Again, the Vanishing Sight, which buys us some extra time, making sure that we can survive against the aggressive strategies. We have things like Increasing Danger and Black Market if you really want to dig for those cards. Like this list, I really love this. Said, like, nope, we're going all in. We're going to find our key pieces, and we're going to try to stabilize that way. And then you have some of the other effects here, when we actually get to see some of the Umbra cards where, you know, class bonus on champion hit, look at that opponent's memory and discard a card from it. But now if you use Mind Break Bullet with Shadow's Twin, now that on hit is going to actually trigger twice and then make them discard multiple cards. So this is now like, if you can line up that board, it's definitely can be played more like a control hand ripping strategy that again plays a little bit differently than the prison style that we might have seen with Luxem, but can still burn your opponent's resources while dealing incremental damage to them turn over turn that you might not have the extra bullet that you need, but these creeping torments are going to stack up and slowly ping away your opponent's life. Now, of course, by the time you probably have a lot of these creeping torments stacked on your opponent, they're probably just dying to other damage anyways, because you've got in chip damage through like your blast shot pump or otherwise, but still allows you to get in that little bit of extra damage that you really wanted. So again, I really love this one. I think Carter is an insane card that got buffed quite a bit in this most recent set. Again, unfortunately, cost-wise, I'm not going to run out and buy them, but I definitely think this is something that if you want to play this archetype and if you want to play like the Umbra Diana, you are absolutely going to want this card with the new support that it got in the most recent set, because you can really make good work out of this card, but wait for a reprint or something similar, because this is one of the most expensive decks in the format, and the water version was actually the second most expensive deck when I was looking at the total breakdown. The Wind Crux Lorraine was actually the most expensive deck at like 890 because of, again, just certain cards needing some reprints very, very badly, but something to, you know, look into once you know a lot more about the game. So if you want to play more of this like champion focus, not as, you know, we've now gone from units to units plus spells to units plus burn on the top to now a very heavy champion focused strategy with now like, hey, my guns are what I got to close out the game with. And again, we do actually have a couple units here which can get in some chip damage when we need to, but very largely focusing on our damage coming from our guns and our bullets. That now plays to the point of like, hey, I am now, you know, the champion who's dealing the damage and not just my units. And in that similar vein, we also have our last list here, which is going to be the Fire Arcane Rai. And this one is for the Magic users out there. If you just love slinging a big fireball at your opponent or having a massive arcane blast for a lot of damage, and you just really want to play that more combo style of deck that can somehow survive till the late game for these big flashy finishes, 100%, this is your list. Lock it in. It is super fun to dig into and really get to explore from just a Magic standpoint. Now, again, you'll notice that we have things like Peaceful Reunion and Vanish from Sight, which again just says, hey, don't attack me for a turn. I want to set up. I want to survive to the late game, as well as Spell Shield Arcane, which says just prevent the damage and get Enlighten counters. Now, the cool thing about Mage, or specifically Rai in this case, is that he gets Enlighten counters, which can be used for some extra draw when you really need it. So if you're someone who wants to draw through your deck very quickly and see a lot of the cards through things like Scry the Skies and getting to glimpse all that amount, because Rai has a really special effect that for however many arcane cards you have in Banish, he gains that many levels. So, you know, you're setting up turns that's like Scry the Skies for 10. Oh, by the way, here's the, you know, here's the Fireball or the Arcane Blast that I was looking for. Vanish First Sight on your turn, go into my turn, Arcane Blast, right? This is definitely something that you need to be aggro on. Make sure that you're aggressor and knock them out before they can set up these plays. Or again, there are some cases where you might just die early on if they hit the absolute high roll and go, sorry, we found the careful studies into the big blast, and you're just dead on the spot, right? So this one, I wouldn't expect to see, you know, really transition into the other elements where we've kind of had a good coverage of like, you know, Allies has a deck in every single element. Fire Rai really does need to have things like the Fireball just literally for the damage, or Creative Shock for the filtering. That this specific style will really not go away from Fire anytime soon. But there are some other like Water Mage stuff that you can be doing, but it's going to be much more ally focused in my opinion, and more like smaller pings worth of damage compared to the massive Fireball or the Arcane Blast for 11 damage that you're going to be seeing. And again, that Arcane Blast, when it stacks up because of efficiency, you're just going to go, okay, sculpt my hand, gain a bunch of levels. Okay, I'm level 11 now. Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast. Good game, right? And that's how you're going to clear out them, those style of games very quickly sometimes. So the last couple things I want to mention here right towards the end of this very long video is going to be the top 8 that we recently just saw from the Ascent this past weekend. Yes, we are going into a wind-heavy meta from what it appears, but every single deck outside of the 2 new recollection decks, or at least these ones down here, are all decks I talked about in this very video. So definitely look forward to checking out these lists, finding out what playstyle you really gravitate towards, and going from there, because there are a lot of viable options to really pick up and play. And I think we're going to see more of the meta develop in the very near future. That makes it worth checking out and really sticking to the champion that you like the most and getting in the reps with. And again, I will probably do this, cover this more in a different video if I have time before other things kick off, but I at least wanted to at least acknowledge this in terms of, hey, look, these lists that we just talked about, did very well in the top 8 and top 32 of this event that just happened. And then the last but not least part is the Mortal Ambition information just got announced, and I'm very excited that we get to see all 7 classes supported, even if it is with this small note of with a focus on mage and warrior classes. Clerics on life support, but hey, we'll get our time one day. And there's 229 unique cards in this set. I think that this is going to be the perfect set to jump into because it's going to help build the foundations. And once we have this initial set going forward, I think this is exactly what we're going to want to see for the game to expand out on these given archetypes that really give players the flexibility to play what they want and really get to explore Grand Archive. So this was a terribly long video. It took me multiple days, dozens of hours to put together. But because of my own time limitations, I wasn't sure when I was going to be able to do another Grand Archive video. So I wanted to put it all out there and put, you know, all my thoughts and time and research into this to hopefully get other people into the game, because I think it is a very good game, but it can be very difficult to parse the information on what do I play? What do the elements do? What champion might I want to have, right? So I really hope you found this video helpful, because it is by far the most time I've spent on any video for this channel in 10 years. And there's a lot to go into. This is also going to be my longest video on the channel from an overall time run standpoint. So I do hope you found this helpful. So my final thoughts kind of here towards the end is, yes, I will continue to play Grand Archive. I am very blessed that True Champion Gaming is my locals. 2 of them just made top 8 of the event that we just talked about, and I just have a very good scene to play in. I realize with how insane the market is and just very difficult to have different shops either, you know, canceling orders or just not having the shelf space for it. The TCG market now more than ever is extremely competitive, and it's very hard to find time for everything. So I realize that not every game can be supported at every store. However, I would recommend asking around and seeing if Grand Archive is supported locally, because it is a good game, and the local support is very good. And probably the most important thing for me personally is the online Yeti locals. Nothing but love for the team that runs those. If you've been following me on Twitter or my YouTube videos or anything, like, for me, having that accessibility is really the biggest thing. And I think for a lot of us that are, again, coming from other card games and trying to look for something new that still has the ability to play it, even if I don't have a locals that I can go to every single week, is such a huge factor in helping dive into a game. Now, again, I'm only from the United States. I can't speak to other regions, but the online support that we have is absolutely stellar. So again, I do hope you'll check it out. Other than that, you know, we'll see where it goes. I still have no idea what I want to be playing, so I hope that this video helped narrow it down for you. But there are a lot of other strategies that I personally want to check out because I think they're very fun. And we have a new set, so obviously there's a lot more decks to check out anyways. But if you are, like me, trying to get into the game 4 sets deep, 600 plus cards, I promise it's not all that bad. And I hope you will enjoy playing Grand Archive. So with that, my friends, thank you so much for sticking until the very end. Stay safe, stay hydrated, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.